The sound of engines roared outside my window at 7 a.m. on a Monday. I jumped out of bed and ran to see what was happening. There in my backyard were 3 men in yellow vests. One was driving a small bulldozer. Another was putting bright orange stakes into the ground right through my garden. The third man was marking a line with spray paint that cut off nearly a quarter of what I thought was my backyard. "Hey!" I shouted as I threw open the window. "What are you doing to my property?" The man with the spray paint looked up at me with a bored expression. "HOA enforcement," he called back. "We're marking the correct property line according to the new survey." I quickly dressed and ran outside. By the time I reached my backyard, they had already marked a straight line from one side to the other. The line cut through my vegetable garden, my fire pit, and came within a few feet of the small storage shed I had built last summer. "There must be some mistake," I said, approaching the man who seemed to be in charge. His name tag said Peterson. "This is my land. I have the papers from when I bought the house 3 years ago." Peterson shook his head. "Not according to the new survey ordered by the Pinecrest Estates HOA board. This updated boundary was approved at the January meeting." He handed me a thick envelope. "This contains the official notice, the new survey documents, and the removal order for any structures now encroaching on community property." I stared at him in disbelief. "Removal order? What are you talking about?" "Your garden, fire pit, and that shed are now on HOA land," he said, pointing to each one. "You have 10 days to remove them, or the HOA will remove them for you and send you the bill." My hands were shaking as I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter dated 3 months ago, supposedly sent to inform me of the boundary adjustment. I had never seen this letter before today. "I never received any notice about this," I said. Peterson shrugged. "Not my department. Take it up with the board if you have a problem." Then he and his crew packed up their equipment and moved on to the next house down the street. I stood in my yard, what was left of it, feeling like someone had pulled the ground out from under me. The garden I had worked so hard on was now apparently on HOA land. The fire pit where my family and I had spent countless evenings was no longer mine. And the shed that had cost me a small fortune in materials and a full month of weekends to build was now in violation of some rule I'd never heard of. As I was trying to make sense of what had just happened, my neighbor Tom walked over. Tom was in his 60s and had lived in Pinecrest Estates since the houses were first built. "They got you too, huh?" he said, eyeing the orange stakes with disgust. "They took 20 feet from my backyard last week. Said it was for a new community path they're planning." "Can they really do this?" I asked him. "Just take our land without any real warning?" Tom's face darkened. "The HOA in this neighborhood has gone power crazy since Martin Webster became president. He and his friends on the board think they can do whatever they want." I spent the rest of that day reading through every page of the documents Peterson had given me. The official notice claimed the original developer had incorrectly surveyed several properties 20 years ago, and the HOA was now reclaiming land that should have been common areas. According to their paperwork, they had voted unanimously to adjust the boundaries of 14 properties, including mine. There was also a copy of the HOA covenant I had signed when buying the house. I had barely glanced at it back then, trusting my real estate agent when she said it was all standard stuff. Now, reading it carefully, I was horrified to discover just how much power I had unknowingly given to the HOA. They could change rules with a simple majority vote, impose fines for violations, and even place liens on homes if those fines weren't paid. By evening, my shock had turned to anger. I wasn't going to let them take my land without a fight. I called several real estate attorneys, but the soonest appointment I could get was 2 weeks away, well after the 10-day deadline to remove my things. The next morning, I decided to confront the HOA board directly. The covenant listed their names and addresses, and Martin Webster, the president, lived just 4 streets over. I arrived at his house at 7:30 a.m., hoping to catch him before he left for work. A short, balding man with a permanent frown opened the door. His scowl deepened when I introduced myself. "The boundary adjustment is not up for discussion," he said before I could even explain why I was there. "It was properly voted on by the board and recorded with the county." "I never received any notice until yesterday," I protested. "When people were already in my yard moving the boundary line." "Notices were mailed to all affected homeowners 3 months ago," he replied. "If you didn't get yours, that's unfortunate, but it doesn't change the board's decision." "This is stealing," I said, my voice rising. "You're taking my property without my consent." Martin's face reddened. "I'd be careful with accusations like that," he warned. "Section 15 of the covenant prohibits homeowners from making defamatory statements about the HOA or its members. The fine for that is $500 per incident. I was stunned by the threat. I just want to understand why this is happening. What's going to be done with the land you're taking? Martin's expression shifted, and for a moment I saw something like smugness. The reclaimed areas will be used for the new Pinecrest Pavilion and Recreation Center. It's going to be a beautiful addition to our community. Where exactly will this pavilion be built? I asked, though I was beginning to suspect the answer. The main structure will be centered behind Oakwood Drive, he said. Oakwood Drive, where Martin and 3 other board members happen to live. Their properties, conveniently, weren't affected by any boundary adjustments. So you're taking land from me and my neighbors to build something that will mostly benefit you and your friends on the board? I asked. This conversation is over, Martin snapped and slammed the door in my face. Over the next few days, I learned I wasn't alone in my anger. 11 other homeowners were facing the same situation. We met at Tom's house to compare notes and discuss options. Most had received the same vague notice months ago but had ignored it, thinking it was just routine HOA paperwork. Now they were all facing the removal of gardens, sheds, playsets, and other backyard features that suddenly encroached on HOA land. We could try to fight this legally, suggested Sandra, a single mom whose children's playset was now supposedly on HOA property. But lawyers are expensive, and the covenant gives the board a lot of power. And they have the neighborhood dues to pay for their legal fees, added Rick, whose new deck was now partially on HOA land. They're using our own money against us. The situation seemed hopeless. Several homeowners had already caved in and removed their encroaching structures rather than face the fines and legal threats. But I wasn't ready to give up. There had to be something we were missing. Tom had been quiet during most of the meeting, but now he spoke up. You know, I was on the original HOA board when this neighborhood was first built, he said. The rules were much simpler back then. Maybe there's something in the old documents that could help us. Tom went to his attic and returned with a dusty box of files. Inside were the original HOA incorporation papers, the first covenant, and 20 years of meeting minutes. We spent hours going through everything, looking for anything that might give us leverage against the current board. It was nearly midnight when Sandra found it, a clause in the original HOA incorporation documents that had never been removed or amended. It stated that any changes to property boundaries within the subdivision required a 75% vote of all homeowners, not just the board. This is it, I exclaimed. They never held a homeowner vote on these boundary changes. They only had a board vote. But our excitement was short-lived. Tom pointed out that the current board would simply claim that newer amendments to the covenant had superseded this requirement. We needed something stronger, something they couldn't dismiss or explain away. As the deadline to remove my shed approached, I decided on a different strategy. Instead of fighting the HOA directly on the boundary issue, I would look for other vulnerabilities in their legal position. I took 2 days off work and went to the county courthouse to search for every document related to Pinecrest Estates and its HOA. What I found there was beyond anything I had hoped for. The HOA had failed to properly file their annual reports with the state for the past 4 years. Under state law, this meant their corporate status had been administratively dissolved 3 years ago. They were no longer a legal entity. Every rule they had passed, every fine they had imposed, and every action they had taken in the past 3 years, including the boundary adjustment, was invalid. But that wasn't all. The HOA had continued to collect dues from homeowners despite not being a legal entity. In my state, collecting money while claiming to be a corporation when you're not one is a form of fraud. I immediately contacted a lawyer named Michael Chen who specialized in HOA disputes. After reviewing my findings, he agreed to represent me and the other affected homeowners. This is what we call a nuclear option in HOA disputes, Michael explained. The board has been operating without legal authority for years. Every decision they've made in that time is potentially void. 2 days later, a crew arrived at my house to remove my shed and garden. They were met by Michael, who served them with a temporary restraining order preventing any action against my property. The crew supervisor made some angry phone calls, but eventually had to leave without touching anything. That evening, Michael and I attended the monthly HOA board meeting. The community center was packed with curious neighbors who had heard rumors of someone challenging the board. Martin Webster looked irritated as he called the meeting to order. When it was time for homeowner comments, Michael stood and introduced himself as my attorney. Before we discuss any business tonight, he said calmly, I need to bring a serious legal matter to the board's attention. He proceeded to explain how the HOA's corporate status had been dissolved years ago, making all their subsequent actions legally void. The room grew completely silent as he detailed how the board had been collecting dues and enforcing rules without any legal authority to do so. Furthermore, Michael continued, my client has already filed the paperwork to reinstate the HOA's corporate status, in his name. State law gives the applicant for reinstatement the right to appoint the initial board of directors. Martin's face turned bright red. That's ridiculous, he shouted. You can't just take over the HOA. Actually, he can, Michael replied. The Pinecrest Estates HOA legally ceased to exist 3 years ago when its corporate status was revoked. My client has simply formed a new entity with the same name, which is his right as a property owner in this subdivision. The room erupted in chaos. Board members were shouting questions at Martin who had no answers. Homeowners who had paid thousands in fines or removed structures from their property based on invalid rules were demanding explanations. Through it all, I sat quietly watching as years of unchecked power crumbled before my eyes. Michael raised his hand for silence. My client has no desire to control the neighborhood, he announced. He simply wants his property respected and the HOA to operate legally and fairly. He proposes a new covenant that requires 75% homeowner approval for any major decisions, including changes to property boundaries or common areas. In the weeks that followed, the old board resigned in disgrace. The boundary adjustment project was abandoned, and property lines were restored to their original surveyed positions. An independent forensic accountant discovered that Martin and 2 other board members had been planning to build the community pavilion, using a construction company owned by Martin's brother-in-law, at a cost nearly double the market rate. With Tom's help and the input of many neighbors, we drafted new simplified HOA rules that protected property values without giving the board excessive power. The new rules included strict transparency requirements, term limits for board members, and required a supermajority of homeowners to approve any significant changes. As for Martin and his allies on the former board, they faced a class action lawsuit from homeowners who had paid invalid fines or had their property damaged by improper enforcement actions. Most of them ended up selling their homes and moving away from Pinecrest Estates. My garden flourished that summer. I expanded it to include a small greenhouse, built without needing anyone's permission beyond standard county permits. The fire pit once again became a gathering place for friends and family on warm evenings. One evening as I was weeding the tomato plants, Tom stopped by to chat. You know, he said, looking out over the neighborhood, what you did wasn't just about saving your backyard. You saved this whole community from people who forgot that an HOA is supposed to serve homeowners, not rule over them. He was right. By finding the legal flaw in the HOA's foundation, their lapsed corporate status, I had done more than protect my own property. I had restored balance to our neighborhood and reminded everyone that even the most powerful local organizations are only as strong as their legal standing. The new HOA board now meets in our community center with full transparency. Meetings are recorded and minutes are promptly published. Major decisions require actual votes from homeowners, not just the board. And property boundaries stay exactly where they belong, where they were when we all purchased our homes. Sometimes the best way to fight back against overreach isn't with shouting or endless arguments, but with quiet research and finding that one crucial detail your opponents never thought you'd discover. Their mistake was thinking I would just accept their decision and give up my land without a fight. They never imagined I would find the nuclear option that would bring their whole power structure crashing down. As Tom likes to say, never mess with a homeowner who knows how to read the fine print. 6 months after the HOA shakeup, I was relaxing on my back patio when my phone rang. It was Sandra, whose children's playset had been threatened by the old board's boundary grab. You won't believe what I just heard, she said, her voice a mix of amusement and disbelief. Martin Webster tried to buy a house in Oak Ridge Heights, and their HOA rejected his application. I nearly choked on my drink. How did they even know about what happened here? Apparently they do background checks that include HOA disputes, Sandra explained. The lawsuit against him came up, and they decided he was too high risk. I couldn't help but laugh at the irony. The man who had wielded HOA rules like a weapon was now being blocked by those same kinds of rules. I also heard something interesting from my cousin who works at the county records office, Sandra continued. Remember how the old board claimed they were correcting boundaries that were incorrectly surveyed? She looked into it and found that the original survey was completely accurate. There was never any mistake to correct. So they made up the whole story about incorrect surveys just to take our land? I asked, though I wasn't really surprised. Exactly. The only error was in their judgment of how far they could push before someone pushed back. After we hung up, I walked to the edge of my yard and looked at where the orange stakes had been, the line that would have cut through my garden, my fire pit, and my memories. In their place was a row of sunflowers I had planted as a reminder. A border that represented not division but growth. The next weekend, our neighborhood held its first annual community barbecue. It was Tom's idea, a way to bring everyone together after the tension of the past months. We held it in the actual community area, not on anyone's seized land. As I helped set up tables and chairs, Rick approached me with a plate of his famous ribs. "You know what the best part of all this is?" he asked, handing me the plate. "I just got a call from my brother in Copper Canyon. He's having problems with his HOA, and I told him about how you found that their corporate status had lapsed. He checked and guess what? His HOA status was revoked 2 years ago for the same reason." "Are you serious?" I asked. Rick nodded. "Dead serious. He's meeting with an attorney tomorrow. Said he's going to pull a Carter on them." He grinned. "That's what they're calling it now, pulling a Carter. It means finding the nuclear option that no one saw coming." I laughed, both embarrassed and a little proud that my name had become shorthand for standing up to HOA overreach. As we walked toward the gathering of neighbors, I spotted Martin Webster's old house, now with a sold sign in the front yard. "Any idea who bought it?" I asked Rick. "Young couple with 2 kids, he replied. "I met them yesterday. First thing they asked me was whether our HOA was reasonable." He chuckled. "I told them we had some problems in the past, but now we have the most fair and transparent HOA in the county." By sunset, nearly every family in Pinecrest Estates had stopped by the barbecue. Children played on the genuine community grounds while their parents chatted and laughed together, many meeting their neighbors properly for the first time. The new HOA board members, elected by actual homeowner votes, served food and answered questions without a hint of the arrogance that had characterized the previous administration. As twilight settled over our neighborhood, Tom called for everyone's attention. He raised his glass in a toast. "To good neighbors, fair rules, and the courage to stand up for what's right," he said, looking directly at me. "And to remembering that housing associations are meant to bring communities together, not tear them apart." Everyone applauded, and many people patted me on the back or offered quiet thanks as the evening continued. But the real reward was seeing our neighborhood transformed, from a place ruled by fear and arbitrary enforcement to a true community where people looked out for each other. That night, as I sat by my fire pit looking up at the stars, I thought about how close we had come to losing not just parts of our yards, but the very concept of home ownership. In finding and using the nuclear option that brought down the corrupt HOA board, I had discovered something important about power. It only works when people believe they have no choice but to obey. The moment someone stands up and says, "No, I'm going to check if you actually have the authority you claim," is the moment when unjust power begins to crumble. My backyard was once again wholly mine, every foot of soil, every plant, every memory I would make here. And beyond my property line was something even more valuable. A neighborhood where the rules existed to serve the people, not control them. Sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice isn't a lawyer or a lawsuit or even righteous anger. Sometimes it's simply the willingness to dig through dusty files until you find that one overlooked detail that changes everything. The nuclear option isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just a forgotten form, an unfiled paper, or a missed deadline that brings down those who thought themselves untouchable. And that's a lesson worth remembering no matter where you live.